All right, guys, I'm not making it up this time. We really are going to elect Lincoln and start the Civil War. This is it. This is it. Horses are fed. We're going. It's go time. You can see it's dark outside, so no excuses for me. All right. So, so in 1858, Stephen A. Douglas, the same guy behind the 1854 Kansas-Nebraska Act, the father of popular sovereignty, and the architect of dismantling the Missouri Compromise and leading to the Civil War. That's not fair to Douglas. There were many factors that led to the Civil War. He was just one of them. Is running for his third term in the United States Senate as a Democrat from the northern state of Illinois. Okay, Douglas is a northern Democrat. And he faces a staunch opposition from the freshman Republican congressman from Illinois, Abraham Lincoln. If you'll recall, Lincoln was elected to Congress in 1846 and sharply opposed America entering the Mexican-American War, even going so far as to propose the Spot Amendment. Mr. Polk, show us the spot where Zachary Taylor's forces were attacked by Mexican forces, Lincoln said. So that was a spot resolution. And Lincoln also was a big proponent of the Wilmot Proviso, which at the beginning of the war, before we'd even beaten Mexico, said that any land or territory gained by Mexico in this war would be rendered, free of slavery. Of course, that did not pass, though, because of the United States Senate and Southern balance of power. Southern votes in the Senate prevented that Wilmot Proviso from happening. So that is Lincoln up to this point that we know him. He is now a Republican. He'd started off as a Whig. He has joined the Republican Party, and he is very much the poster child for what the Republican Party stands for, that they are against the expansion of slavery. Now, Lincoln, at this point in time, is not an abolitionist. He is a politician. He is very careful to say that he basically is not for freeing all the slaves where they already are. He wants to leave slavery intact where it is, but no expansion of slavery. For the free, common, average, poor white man, slavery could not, should not, cannot expand out west. They needed that land for their, Jeffersonian ideals and stuff. And Lincoln was a frontiersman. He'd grown up on a frontier farm and a log cabin and all that. He was not very well formally educated, but prolific reader, and did not like the farm life. And he married very well. There's a great story about his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, after they married. She was one of the great belles, not for her beauty. She was one of the great belles of Kentucky, and her family, the Todds, they were like one of the aristocratic slave-owning families of Kentucky. And all of the dudes wanted her stuff. And I'm being literal about that. They didn't want like her body. Sorry, I'm going beyond PG-13 here. I'm sorry, guys. Y'all are little sophomores. They wanted her money, and they wanted the power of her family. That's what they wanted, the prestige and the political support that the Todd family and Kentucky could give by a political marriage. And so her suitors literally included Stephen Douglas and John C. Breckinridge and Abraham Lincoln. Now, she marries Abraham Lincoln. Which one becomes president? Oh, yeah, Abraham Lincoln. So very powerful political connection there with the Todds, Mary Todd Lincoln. Anyway, so yeah, this is the setup. Lincoln and Stephen Douglas are running for Senate, and Lincoln doesn't have a whole lot of political experience, but he's got a very powerful wife. And Lincoln, knowing that he's at a disadvantage here against the famous Stephen Douglas, who's been basically trying to be president the last, decade or so, is going to challenge Douglas to a series of debates. And there were dozens of these all throughout the state of Illinois that have become known as the Lincoln-Douglas debates. The formatting was very simple. It would be 60 minutes of the first speaker talking. Then it would be 90 minutes of the second speaker talking, followed by a rebuttal of 30 minutes. And they did this, and they switched off each time with Douglas as the incumbent senator speaking first. The first debate. And they did this throughout the state, and they drew huge crowds because the predominant topic of these debates was, of course, the issue of slavery and the expansion of slavery in the United States, which was causing such turmoil at this time. And Douglas, was very prominent nationally, it was expected that he would make a run for president. So, I mean, this had a lot of national attention. And when they had debates near the border of Illinois with other states, many hundreds, even thousands of people from other states came to hear these two men speak. And this is where Lincoln gives his famous House Divided speech. There's the quote there: "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free." That's where Lincoln gives the speech. Lincoln repeatedly in these debates talks about how freedom was opposition to the expansion of slavery, and he attacks Douglas particularly on the issue of popular sovereignty. And Douglas would attack Lincoln for being a abolitionist, which Lincoln denied. Lincoln says, "I am not interested in freeing the slaves where they are," because again, Lincoln has political ambitions. He knows that you lose half the country if you come out saying that you're against slavery in general. So he can't just say that. And maybe his personal opinions, we don't know. But this is also worth mentioning that this is before the 17th Amendment, which doesn't get passed until the early 1900s. We're a ways away from that. And so senators, United States senators at this time, the two from each state, they were not elected in a popular election by the people of the states. They were actually chosen by the state legislatures at this time. And so that is who Lincoln and Douglas were campaigning to. And at one point, Lincoln really gets Douglas on his popular sovereignty stance by making Douglas actually take a stance. That was the whole reason why Douglas in the Kansas-Nebraska Act had laid down this idea of popular sovereignty, so that he wouldn't have to take a stance on the issue of slavery. By giving popular sovereignty, you're allowing the people of the territory to choose whether they want to enter as a free state or a slave state. So you as the politician don't have to come out and say, well, I'm for slavery or I'm against slavery, because then you'd, again, lose half of your constituency, your votes. But Lincoln kind of pins Douglas down by pointing out, so Mr. Douglas, you have that issue of popular sovereignty. Well, what if the people of the states of Kansas and Nebraska, what if they say that they don't want slavery? Well, and Douglas has to say, well, then the people of those places have decided that they don't want slavery, and slavery will not expand. Aha. See Southerners, see slaveholders, see pro-slavery people. He's not going to defend your slavery. So, Lincoln loses nothing in doing that, because, I mean, everybody already knows he's a Republican. He's against the expansion of slavery, so he's not going to get those votes anyway. But now, nationally, since all of the newspapers of the day were printing these debate speeches, it was actually fascinating. This is the proliferation of a new technology of the day called the telegraph. That's where you use Morse code, the beep, 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 beep. I'll stop. Sorry. And telegraph wires were starting to come up all around the United States. We began to see the telegraph in the 1840s. By the Civil War, it'll be all throughout the North and parts of the South. And so these debate speeches, stenographers were writing down all the words they could get, and then telegraphers were sending the telegraphs along these wires, and they were going to all these different cities. Pro-Douglas supporters were, of course, misprinting Lincoln's words, and pro-Lincoln people were doing the same. They were misprinting Douglas's words. But everybody around the nation was reading this, and this really kind of hurt Douglas's chances in the upcoming 1860 presidential election. It also, conversely, is going to promote this national figure status for Abraham Lincoln. It promotes him on the national stage as a political force for the Republican Party, kind of helping him to secure the Republican nomination in the election of 1860. And then we get to John Brown. All right, I want to go back to Bleeding Kansas for just a second. Okay, remember, John Brown is this very, very hardcore, deeply devout abolitionist who is going in with his sons. He's got many sons, to Kansas to support the free state movement in Kansas, the Lawrence, Kansas Constitution and everything. And he's the one with his sons that hacked to pieces those 5 pro-slavery men at Potawatomi Creek, that massacre. And that was following days of massacring in one of the free state anti-slavery cities where dozens had been killed by pro-slavery border ruffians. Okay, so he was all up in that violence of Kansas. And he'd actually, he put his money where his mouth was. He wanted to cause a violent uprising of slaves in the South and lead them to freedom against the Southern white slave owners. He saw that as his life's purpose, his mission from God. And he led out in the dead of winter several slaves throughout, like going over 1,000 miles all the way to Canada. He led them. And in 1859, he is recruiting a slave army, former escaped slaves, to storm the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, gain the weapons, the ammunitions there, and start his slave uprising. So that is John Brown. Now, what had triggered the Potawatomi brutal massacre with the hacking to death of these pro-slavery guys there in Kansas was the caning of Charles Sumner, a Massachusetts Northern senator, an actual, honest to God, like actual abolitionist senator, not like Lincoln saying, oh, we don't want the expansion of slavery, but like an actual guy who's like, slavery is wrong. Black people are humans who deserve rights. Like, that was radical talk for the 1850s. In 1856, Charles Sumner gave a big speech, very, very public, very controversial speech on the floor of the Senate, where he basically denounced the slave owners. And he in particular called out the very old senator from South Carolina, Mr. Butler, Senator Butler of South Carolina, and basically said that these slave owners like Mr. Butler, were raping the institution of slavery, and slavery was their mistress that they were defiling. And he was making all these metaphors that weren't so veiled. They were pretty clear about how many slave masters would sleep and rape their slave women and have those children who were then themselves slaves, like with Frederick Douglass, like with Thomas Jefferson, we talked about with the Sally Hemings affair. So he made these not so secret metaphors in his speech about Mr. Butler sleeping with slaves and how vile the institution of slavery was, and made no holds barred. He wanted to get rid of it. And Preston Brooks, this was the nephew of Senator Butler, took issue to Senator Sumter's language and is going to do something about it. His Southern honor had been defiled, he said. So he's going to get his Southern honor back. So he takes his old cane, and Preston Brooks is a much younger man. He was a congressman from South Carolina. And with some friends, they go into the Senate chamber. On one side of the Capitol, you got the House of Representatives. On the other side, you got the Senate. So he goes over to the Senate chamber with his buds, and they catch Sumner while Sumner was at his desk, I think, signing some of the autographs of his speech where he called out Butler. And Preston Brooks lays into Sumner with his cane. He starts beating Senator Sumner over the head in the Capitol building with his cane, breaking his cane over the senator's head. And Sumner was trapped between his desk and his chair. In the Capitol building, those seats that they have there are locked in. They're not like the kind you can move back. They're fixed to the floor. And so he was trapped there. And then finally somebody said, that's enough. And they got Sumner out of there. Sumner's skull was broken in multiple places. He barely survived the attack. And just the horrifying nature of that this was done to a United States senator on the floor of the Senate chamber in the Capitol building by United States congressmen. This is indicative of the level of hatred and discord and chaos and violence that was flaring up in the United States in 1856 over the issue of slavery. And this news of this travels quickly and spreads like wildfire, igniting many people fervently on either side. Many Southerners, like in South Carolina, they donated Preston Brooks a lot of canes, decorative canes, in commemoration and adoration for his heroic deed of putting this upstart abolitionist senator in his place. I think in a museum in South Carolina today, you could still see some of those canes. And in the North, of course, many were horrified. This confirmed the slave power conspiracy. And of course, this is going right along with the time period, the Dred Scott decision, confirming there's a slave power conspiracy in the United States federal government. And so this was the event that set off John Brown and his sons, that precipitated that massacre at Potawatomi Creek in Kansas. Well, so John Brown had kept busy after that massacre and freed some slaves and was recruiting. He actually stayed for a while in Frederick Douglass's house in Rochester, New York, upstate New York, along the Erie Canal, and actually tried to convince Douglass himself to join in this slave uprising. Douglass said, you know, sorry, man, you're very dedicated to the cause, appreciate it, but I wouldn't be any good for that. After what happens to John Brown, and after his death, Douglass is quoted as saying something like, you know, John Brown was a very dedicated man to the eradication of the disease of slavery. I'm willing to live for slavery, you know, write my books and champion against slavery. John Brown was willing to die for the slave. That's what Frederick Douglass said. John Brown also approached, when he was in Canada, you know, tendering those escaped slaves. He helped break out and kill their masters. When he was in Canada, he actually encountered Harriet Tubman. And so this tells you in the 1850s, you know, the legend of Harriet Tubman had already grown to quite a point. And he met with her and tried to recruit her as well. Because, I mean, who knew better how to get escaped slaves, you know, for the cause? Harriet Tubman, she was a pretty smart lady and saw this guy was maybe writing checks his body couldn't cash and his brain couldn't cash, and said, you know, I appreciate your efforts, man, but I don't think it's going to be as easy as what you're talking about. It's not going to go down that way. So she also kind of declined his offer. So when John Brown does have his slave army, it's only going to be a few dozen people. Some were escaped slaves, a few were northern-born freedmen, and some were just his sons. And they take the train to Harpers Ferry, Virginia, where the federal arsenal was. And they actually, the first, I shouldn't laugh, but the first victim that they killed was the train attendant on the train that they took in, who was trying to alert the authorities that, hey, these guys are suspicious, and talking about, you know, raiding the federal arsenal. He was going to alert the authorities, so they killed him. And the train attendant was actually an African-American man. Whoops. Yeah. Anyway, so they go in and they take the federal arsenal because there wasn't a huge defense force there. I mean, who's gonna raid this for the guns? And immediately, because of their incident with the train, the train goes on and the conductor alerts the authorities. And because the telegraph, news of this travels very quickly. And so President Buchanan is going to send in the federal forces led by General Robert E. Lee. There he is, General Robert E. Lee of Virginia, leader of the federal forces, veteran of the Mexican-American War, is going to go in and quickly quash this little revolt of John Brown's. Several of his sons die, most of the freedmen die, most of the people that were engaged in this die. John Brown is very, very heavily wounded, but taken alive and put on trial at a very public trial in Virginia. Don't know if Virginia should have made it as public as it was. Is after Virginia tries John Brown for treason and trying to take a federal arsenal, and sentenced him to death on like 3 counts of inciting riot and revolution and raiding federal arsenal. He's definitely sentenced to death by hanging. He had like 6 weeks there where he's sitting in this jail waiting for his execution, where he gets to visit his wife, you know, one last conjugal visit, and gets to see his remaining sons, and writes a whole bunch of letters and stuff, basically saying that he's ready to die. He's happy to die because he's going to die a martyr. You know what a martyr is? Like Jesus on the cross. Okay. A martyr is somebody who dies for a cause, whose legacy lives beyond their death, whose life had meaning because they died very publicly. So John Brown welcomed death. There's a lot of famous pictures of John Brown. He's very famous in a lot of African American history and culture. Yeah, he's a white man that was willing to die, and happily to die, for the cause of ending slavery and for African American rights. And here's a famous drawing of John Brown being led to his execution, and there is a African American woman letting her child hug John Brown and say goodbye there. So that is John Brown. Now, why did I spend so much time talking about this? Well, Northerners had the conspiracy of the slave power, that slaveholding interest had taken over the three branches of our federal government for the, efforts to expand the institution of slavery. Southerners also had their paranoia as well, rooted in conspiracy theories as well. That's going to fuel this fire of civil war, pitting brother against brother and all of that. And the Southern conspiracies, as far as they go, were just realized by what happened with John Brown, because their fear was that somebody would lead a slave uprising against them, and would lead slaves to killing their masters and uprooting their entire Southern way of life, which rested on the institution of slavery. And so that's what John Brown stood for, and that's what he tried to do, and that's what he died becoming a martyr for. And so Southerners were very upset by what had happened. This confirmed their worst fears. Now we get to the election of 1860. The election of 1860. So the election of 1860, I mean, we'll see what happens with 2020 election. Joe Biden, at this point, I'm filming on October 24th. Sorry, November 24th, 2020. He won the election and has received, I think, something like 290 electoral votes. The swing states of Georgia, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and even Arizona all narrowly won in Biden's favor. And the transition is beginning, but there are many that are refusing to acknowledge Biden's victory, and the Electoral College has yet to convene, as they are scheduled to in December. So that is upcoming. And then, of course, we'll see what happens the inauguration. President Trump has still not acknowledged Biden's victory or made any sort of concessions. So we're in an interesting predicament right here in the fall of 2020, as a raging pandemic known as COVID-19 is leading to hundreds of thousands of new cases every week. So the election of 1860 was pretty dang important too, though. At stake was the Union, the United States of America. That's what was at stake. Would it stay together, or as the song goes, would it go? And it's one of those very rare elections in which you had four actually somewhat viable candidates. We've had elections where there's, more than Democrats and Republicans in recent history. There's the Green Party candidate, the independent candidate, and so on. Pardon me. But I can only think of two elections that, well, no, three. I can think of three elections that had viable four different candidates running. And it's always going to be kind of a cluster bleep when that happens, because the person who wins is guaranteed basically not to win with a majority, with over half the vote. They're almost guaranteed to win with a plurality, which is meaning that they don't have most of the people's votes. Instead, they just have more than the other people do. That's why they win. And so that's what we're left with. The other two elections, by the way, would be 1824, the corrupt bargain with JQA and Henry Clay and all that, which we've gone over a lot, so I'm not going to rehash that. And then looking forward, 1912 was another of those historic elections. But 1860, the four candidates, you have a sectional party now in the North, and that is the Republican Party. They nominate Abraham Lincoln as their candidate. Abraham Lincoln, coming off of the Lincoln Douglas debates, he lost the Senate. He is very inexperienced when it comes to his political expertise. Like, he'd only been a congressman from Illinois for one term, for 2 years. Then he lost his Senate bid to Stephen Douglas. But through those debates, his name rose to national prominence, and Lincoln was actually seen as the moderate choice. The more radical choice of the Republican Party that embodied more of the Fremont platform from 1856, like more abolition based than just let's halt the expansion of slavery based, was that of William H. Seward. And Seward will become very important. He will become, this is where the famous book Team of Rivals comes, but Seward will become Lincoln's Secretary of State. More on him later. But Abraham Lincoln will be the Republican. And remember, the Republican Party is only in the North. But the North has way more people than the South does, especially if you're not counting the blacks, which the South did not when it came to political representation. Now, the Democratic Party, the last truly national political party in the North and South, is going to be splintered by this election. So this is where I've said it many times, and I'm going to repeat it again, just because it needs saying in these modern times with everything floating out there on the internet. The Democratic Party that started under Jackson undergoes a lot of transformations. It is not the same Democratic Party that we have today. It undergoes numerous transformations. And so here in 1860, it literally splits. The Northern Democrats are going to choose Stephen Douglas of Illinois. He had been waiting. It's been almost 15 years for his chance to become president. He started off with the railroads, this idea of a transcontinental railroad. He needed that old Louisiana territories incorporated, so he pushed forth the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the idea of popular sovereignty and all of this. Longtime senator from Illinois, Stephen Douglas, will be the Northern Democratic pick. And at the Democratic Convention, this is where the Southern bloc of the Democrats walk out. They refuse to accept Douglas's nomination because, remember, in those debates, Lincoln had pinned Douglas that the issue of popular sovereignty worked both ways. That if you allowed the people of those territories to choose whether they wanted to be free or slave, and they chose to be free, then you were outlawing slavery in those Western areas. And Southerners did not appreciate that that was something Douglas supported. So they walk out of the Democratic Convention. And instead, Southern Democrats are going to choose John C. Breckinridge to be their nominee. So Breckinridge will actually be representing the Southern Democrats, the slaveholding interests. He was seen as more of a moderate choice. So he's basically just, we're going to preserve the institution of slavery, and we're going to let the West, decide what it may, but hopefully it becomes slave states. So he is the slaveholding interest. And then there's a fourth political party that came basically just in this election year in 1860, brand new political party that does pretty dang well for itself. And I want to say regionally, if the Republicans are the North, if Stephen Douglas is the Democrats of the North and Breckinridge is the Democrats of the South really, the Deep South, then this new fourth party, the Constitutional Union Party, who chooses John Bell of Tennessee, they represent the border states. Those are the states you see on the map here between the North and the South that had slaveholding interests, but also many, free state interest and many white people who did not own slaves. And these mostly slave owning states on the border region, they shared a lot of commerce with the North, a lot of the railroads with the North. They were tied economically and through the railroads and industry with the North. They don't want the Union to split apart. So their entire platform just said, hey, let's not break up over this, guys. Let's agree to follow the Constitution and keep the Union together. Now, that meant keeping slavery as well. So that was appealing to slaveholders. But that was the Constitutional Union Party with John Bell. And they do pretty dang well for themselves. One of the people in the running for the nomination of this new, very quickly put together fourth party, the Constitutional Union Party, interestingly, was the Texas governor, Sam Houston. Sam Houston, who had helped Texas become independent with the famous, he was our George Washington leading our forces in the Texas Revolution, victor at the 18-minute long decisive victory at San Jacinto against Santa Anna. Sam Houston, Texas Republic's first and third president, a senator from the state of Texas, and now governor of the state of Texas, was a nominee or a potential candidate in the running for the nomination to the Constitutional Union Party, just missing out to John Bell. And so those are your candidates. And they are regional candidates and issue candidates, and it goes about as you would expect, where the candidate representing most of the interest of the North gets most of the Northern vote, which is Abraham Lincoln. You can see pretty much every free state in the map here that's in red. These are the number of electoral votes that each state got back in the 1860 presidential election. It's interesting to see how these numbers have shifted and changed and grown or shrank over time. But every free state voted for Lincoln. The deep South states, that's from South Carolina down to Texas, solidly voted for John C. Breckinridge, the Southern Democrat. The Constitutional Union Party of John Bell, those border states, they voted for John Bell. And then Stephen Douglas, the Northern Democrat, really, his party left him. There's nowhere for him to go. Most of the Northern support he might have gotten went to Lincoln. And so Douglas only carries the border state of Missouri, losing out pretty decisively. And that is the election of 1860. Now, the reason why it's going to basically be the beginning of the Civil War is you'll notice Lincoln does not carry any southern state, not even any of the border states. No state that had slavery, at least legalized slavery, is going to vote for Lincoln. In fact, in 10 of the southern states, Lincoln did not even appear on the ballot for people to vote on him. There was less than 30,000 votes throughout this entire region of the South for Abraham Lincoln, and yet he is the president elected in 1860. And when you have a president elected that a good over a third of the nation didn't vote for, hashtag not my president, that's going to lead to some problems. That's going to lead to secession. Secession is the idea states have the right to leave the country and separate from the United States. That is what it means to secede, not to succeed, but to secede, to leave the Union, to separate, basically. Here we go. So the election is in November. Already in December 20th, you're going to have secession conventions taking place in many of the deep South states. And in South Carolina, big surprise, the Pimento Republic, right? In South Carolina, in their secession convention, the South Carolinians vote to secede from the Union. They say, legally, constitutionally, that their right comes from the fact that they had willingly entered into the Union, so they had a right to leave it. And this is such a big question, right? But like, why did the South secede? Why did, Lincoln getting elected lead to these southern states leaving the country, leading to the death of hundreds of thousands of Americans? More Americans die in the Civil War than in any other American war combined. Like, this is such a big question. Why did the Civil War happen? Why did the South secede? Um, and I mean, the simple answer that ignores a lot of the minutia and details and everything else. The simple answer is because of slavery. Okay, but simple answers don't really get to the heart of anything, right? Well, I guess they do. They get to the heart of it, but they don't explain anything. And that's what I want you guys to be able to do is explain, okay, what was it about Lincoln's election and slavery that led to this? Well, Lincoln, as a Republican, was basically on a platform about making sure that slavery did not expand. All right. So if you're a deep South state, those are the states in the map on here that are in the deep blue. If you're one of those states, I mean, yeah, it's got to be disheartening that you won't be able to see slavery expand west, but why does that mean you need to leave the country? Okay, have your state leave the Union. Well, obviously, there were many whites in the South that desperately wanted expansion for their own hopes of one day having a plantation and accumulating the riches that they saw from the planter class. So that was disheartening. They also believed, and this was referenced in one of the debates, in the Lincoln Douglas debates, that Lincoln had said that slavery would eventually be ended. Okay, it might take a long time, but eventually slavery would go. So if you're a Southerner, that's pretty clear that this guy, this Republican Party, this man Abraham Lincoln, they're about ending your way of life, which rested on the institution of slavery for you to have a cheap labor source to grow your crops, your cash crops like cotton, and make your wealth and have the standard of living that you did. That was eventually going to be ended if these Republicans like Lincoln had their way. And now he's the president, the chief enforcer. So that's the biggest one. And then also many of these southern states, they're thinking, in the long term, that if slavery is restricted and it's closed in to just these deep South states, and eventually it's outlawed in the border states and it's outlawed out west, there's nowhere for it to expand to. Slaves that are in those places, eventually, as the economies in those places shift, maybe slavery is not even outlawed, but maybe it starts to go away in those places. Those slaves would be sold off, and their prices will be dirt cheap. Okay, slaves were the most valuable commodity in the South by far. Okay, slaves were the most valuable commodity by far, and if slaves in territories and western places and in border states and in this northern part, the upper part of the South, this place is in gray. If slaves there were sold off and the value had decreased, they would end up in the deep South, which would flood the market, which would further devalue the price of a slave. So this again would hurt their southern economy. And they would also risk having violent slave uprisings when you have a black population that would theoretically begin to outnumber the white population. Remember, why is it South Carolina that's always causing the problems? That's always the first one to vote for nullification and for secession and everything else. Yes, I'm hearkening back to the nullification crisis with John C. Calhoun and Andrew Jackson back in the 1830s. It was South Carolina again. Well, it's because, remember, they started off as a colony from Barbados that shifted its Caribbean lifestyle over to the Americas. Sugar and rice planting there, which required a huge population, cheap labor source of slaves. The slave population almost outnumbered the white population there. Okay. They had to have extremely harshly enforced slave codes, the black codes, or they risked having insurrections, Stonewall Rebellion, and others. So this is kind of where we're at. South Carolina is going to secede, going to leave the Union. on December 20th, 1860. Okay. Lincoln won the election with a plurality. So he got more votes than these other three guys, but he didn't have over half the votes. He's the president-elect, but this is the in-between period, the interregnum, if you will. So basically, Lincoln's got to wait until he can be inaugurated as president. And during this time, as you guys should know by now, it wasn't January, because that'll come with the 20th Amendment. It was actually March when presidents were sworn in. So Lincoln has to wait from November to March 1861 before he could become president. And meanwhile, he sees these southern states start to leave, first with South Carolina, and then one by one, each of these states of the Deep South. In fact, South Carolina, Alabama, and Mississippi, they had already said that if Lincoln was elected, hashtag not my president, that they would leave. That's what they did in December of 1860. Georgia's vote was much closer than the rest of the Deep South, but they still vote to secede. Part of the reason that 130 of the delegates to the Secession Convention in Georgia voted against leaving the Union was because Georgia has a big region up in the north, part of the Appalachian Mountains, the Hill people, if you want to call them that did not own slaves. That did not want to put their lives at risk for this effort, but they still vote to secede. Florida votes to secede. Louisiana, main shipping port for the cotton trade in New Orleans, votes to secede. And Texas, in February of 1860, is the last of the Deep South states to secede. And Texas waited so long, not because there was a staunch anti-secession movement in Texas, but mostly because the governor of Texas refused to allow the convention, the secession convention, to meet because he did not want his state that he helped to create entering into war against the country that he loved. And that was, of course, Sam Houston. Sam Houston begged and pleaded and did everything he could to try to prevent Texas from entering the Confederacy. But he will eventually be voted out of office, basically, and told to sit down and shut up, Houston. And so Texas will vote to secede in February of 1860, joining the deep southern states. They meet in Alabama, and they're going to appoint, they don't elect it first, they appoint among them a president of this new Confederate states, because they believe strongly in states' rights. Every state has the right to secede, right? Every state has the right to keep its slave holdings as they are and protect the rights of the property of its white citizenry. And so with this foundation, the strong foundation of states' rights, states' right to own slaves, for its people to own slaves, that is where you get the idea of a confederacy. Confederacy, like the Articles of Confederation, remember? America's first governing document. It's a loosely bound group of states that are almost like each their own independent nations that kind of work together on some things that are specified, but can mostly operate independently, which makes doing things like fighting a war against a bigger, more powerful opponent very difficult, because you're struggling for each state to provide, stuff and money and soldiers and horses and cattle and all this other stuff. So they meet, they're going to form the Confederate States of America. They write their own constitution, which strongly upholds the right to own slaves. And they appoint as their first president Jefferson Davis, Jeff Davis, who is a very popular senator from Mississippi. Jefferson Davis, he saw himself as a benevolent slave owner. He was a commandant of West Point, a military man, extensive career in the government. Before he was senator of Mississippi, he'd also been Secretary of War. And so Jefferson Davis will be the Confederate States of America's president, their first and only. And then we get to the question of what happens next. This is by March. By the time Lincoln is sworn in, this is the state of things. Those states that are in the deep blue, they have left the country. If it was just those deep blue states, though, the Civil War might not have happened. Those states did not have the infrastructure, did not have the white population, did not have the industry necessary to wage a war in the 1860s. They did not. It all rested on the border states. And of the border states, the most important by far was the state of Virginia, which had, and since the inception of the United States of America, and since the beginning of the British colonization of the Americas, Virginia had the largest population. So it all rested with Virginia. This is where famously Robert E. Lee said, "I cannot go against my native Virginians." When Virginia left, that's when Robert E. Lee switched sides over to the Confederacy, became the main Confederate general. Lincoln wanted Robert E. Lee to be heading the Union forces. He had his pick. And so with those border states, a lot of them, that's the ones in the light blue, like the aquamarine, the ones in the gray, they were kind of the opinion of, let's wait and see what happens. It's kind of like where we're at right now. Let's wait and see what happens. Let's wait until Lincoln's elected and see, how bad it is. There's election campaign rhetoric, and then there's actual action. Surely Congress and the Supreme Court, still being controlled in the Senate and the Supreme Court by slaveholding interests, will temper and check this radical Black Republican president. That was what Southerners always referred to the Republicans as, Black Republicans, because they were saying that the Republican Party was interested in helping Black people, which some of them were. It was seen as an insult. Oh, God. So bad. So they were of the wait and see approach, these border states, these states in the middle between the North and South. And then everything's going to change because of the attack at Fort Sumter in the summer of 1861. And that is what's going to cause Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas, those gray states, to leave the Union and to join the Confederacy. And that's when you got yourself an actual civil war. So when the Southern states seceded and left the Union following Lincoln's election of 1860, there were still numerous federal forts in the Southern occupied territory. And by the way, Lincoln, who has got his hands tied behind his back basically until he's inaugurated in March, while all these deep South states were leaving, including Texas, he says that what they're doing is illegal, that they have no right, that they literally can't leave the Union. So he's not recognizing this. They can't leave the Union. That's Lincoln's stance. It's not possible for them to do this. And so these federal installations, these forts, these now represent a problem to the new Confederate States of America. What do they do with them? If they try to take them over, now they will be seen as the aggressors. And neither side wanted to be the aggressors. Both sides wanted to have the moral high ground in this conflict. And so there was a fort in Louisiana. There's a Fort Pensacola, Florida. And then, of course, famously, Fort Sumter is where it's all going to go down. Fort Sumter was in Charleston Harbor in guess which state? The state of South Carolina. And it was commanded by Lieutenant, or was he captain? I don't remember his ranking, but Anderson, Captain Anderson. And Commander Anderson is, he had served in the Mexican-American War alongside Jefferson Davis. He had been the West Point artillery instructor. And one of his students was actually P.T. Beauregard, who was the first Confederate general named by the new Confederate government out of Montgomery, Alabama, where Jeff Davis was just appointed the president of the new Confederate States of America, the CSA. And President Buchanan, the outgoing president, had tried to send a non-combatant supply ship to resupply this fort because Commander Anderson said they were running low on supplies. They don't want to leave this fort because, you know, it's an American fort, and this is still the United States of America, even though these southern states say that no, it's not. And so the supply ship is turned around, though, and so it really does become a siege. And then finally, in April of 1861, P.T. Beauregard, the former student of Major, I think he's a Major, Major Anderson, is going to begin the siege for real, firing his cannons at the fort. Anderson can't use the big guns on the top that were meant for approaching enemy ships because then he'd be putting his men at risk. So he had to use the lower guns, which weren't really able to reach Charleston's mainland. And so he's not really able to do much, but both sides kind of fired each other for a while. And finally, communications are sent back and forth, and Major Anderson agrees to evacuate his troops, not to surrender. And during the evacuation ceremony, they do a traditional 100-gun salute, and sparks go off, igniting some of the munitions. And in that explosion, the only fatalities of this initial battle, if you want to call it that, of the Civil War, two of Anderson's Federalist Union, that's the North, that's the United States of America, soldiers are hit by the shrapnel and will die. There's also a horse that was killed during the bombardment. So really, a horse was the first casualty of the Civil War, unless you're going back to Bleeding Kansas. And so Major Anderson will go back up to the north with the American flag and do a big recruitment effort. Lincoln will use this provocation by the South to basically request the additional recruitment and of 75,000 more American soldiers to help suppress this insurrection from the South. He does not recognize the South as being separated, as seceding. Now, during the negotiations for Fort Sumter, the Southern delegates of this new Confederate government actually went to Washington, D.C. and offered to pay Lincoln for these federal arsenals, these federal forts in their Southern territory. And again, Lincoln refused, because if he did, he would be recognizing the South as a legitimate nation that you could do dealings with. So he refuses to sell, doesn't want to offer any recognition. And now with 75,000 new recruits being recruited by the North under Lincoln's call to arms, that is when those final border states, and most importantly, the very large, influential, and very strategically, geographically, importantly located state of Virginia, will join the Confederate States of America. So we got us a Civil War. All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop there. We'll talk about ways in which the war was fought next time, and we'll get into the actual fighting. We'll get into Bull Run. All right, thank you guys. I'll talk to you later.